The stone walls of the Tower of London have long been associated with royal authority, confinement, and the controlled disappearance of political threats. Historical records indicate that while the tower functioned as a fortress, treasury, and royal residence, it also served a more discreet purpose: the containment of individuals whose existence complicated the stability of the crown. Among them were noble women, figures whose rank did not exempt them from imprisonment, but rather redefined the terms under which their confinement unfolded. Surviving documents suggest that the imprisonment of noble women was rarely arbitrary. Their detentions were typically embedded within larger political conflicts involving succession disputes, accusations of treason, religious upheaval, or factional rivalries at court. Unlike common prisoners, whose presence in the tower might be recorded in brief administrative entries, the confinement of noble women was often documented through correspondence, financial accounts, and legal proceedings, reflecting both their status and the sensitivity of their cases. Contemporary accounts describe how noble women brought into the tower were not treated uniformly. Their conditions depended heavily on their rank, the nature of their alleged offense, and the prevailing political climate. High-ranking prisoners were often assigned private chambers within the inner wards, sometimes attended by personal servants, and permitted a degree of comfort consistent with their social standing. Yet these privileges did not mitigate the underlying reality of surveillance and restriction. Movement was limited, communication was monitored, and the possibility of release remained uncertain. Chroniclers noted that imprisonment within the tower could be both a physical and psychological constraint. Noble women, accustomed to influence and visibility within court life, found themselves isolated from networks of patronage and information. Letters, when allowed, were subject to scrutiny. Requests for intervention or clarification often passed through layers of bureaucracy before reaching the monarch or council. Legal codes of the period reveal that accusations against noble women, particularly those involving treason, were treated with a severity that reflected anxieties about lineage and legitimacy. A noblewoman's marriage, alliances, and potential offspring could all be interpreted as political liabilities. One of the earliest documented cases illustrating this dynamic involves Eleanor of Gloucester, whose fall from favor in the mid-15th century demonstrates how accusations of sorcery and treason could intersect with gendered expectations of influence. Historical records indicate that Eleanor, as the wife of the Duke of Gloucester, occupied a position close to royal power. When she was accused of employing astrologers and engaging in practices interpreted as attempts to harm the king, the charges carried implications not only of personal misconduct, but of political ambition. Surviving documents suggest that her imprisonment in the tower was part of a broader effort to neutralize perceived threats within the royal family. Her subsequent public penance and lifelong confinement illustrate how the system extended beyond incarceration into ritualized displays of submission. The tower's role as a site of containment became even more pronounced during periods of dynastic instability. In the late 15th century, the Wars of the Roses produced a series of imprisonments that included noble women connected to rival claims. Chroniclers noted that these detentions were often preventive rather than punitive. Women who could serve as symbolic figures for opposition factions were confined to limit their capacity to mobilize support. The presence of such prisoners within the tower underscores the extent to which political legitimacy was understood as a matter of both bloodline and visibility. Surviving administrative records reveal that the cost of maintaining noble prisoners was carefully tracked. Wardens were responsible for providing food, lodging, and in some cases, clothing appropriate to the prisoner's rank. These expenses were sometimes borne by the crown, though in other instances they were charged against the prisoner's own estates. This financial dimension of imprisonment reflects a system in which punishment and administration were intertwined. The management of noble women within the tower required not only physical security, but also the preservation of hierarchical norms. By the 16th century, the tower had become closely associated with the religious and political transformations of the Tudor period. The reign of Henry VIII introduced new forms of scrutiny, particularly regarding loyalty to the crown's evolving religious policies. Historical records indicate that noble women who resisted or were perceived to resist these changes could find themselves accused of treason or heresy. The mechanisms of control extended beyond formal charges, encompassing interrogation, surveillance, and the strategic use of imprisonment to enforce compliance. One of the most extensively documented cases is that of Anne Boleyn. Contemporary accounts describe her arrest in 1536 as a carefully orchestrated event, with charges that included adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king. While the veracity of these accusations has been debated by historians, surviving documents suggest that her imprisonment in the Tower followed established protocols for high-ranking detainees. She was lodged in the royal apartments she had once occupied as queen, a detail that chroniclers noted for its symbolic significance. Her execution, carried out within the Tower grounds, reinforced the site's function as both a place of confinement and a stage for the resolution of political crises. The experiences of other noblewomen during this period further illustrate the variability of conditions within the Tower. Catherine Howard, also accused of adultery, was confined under stricter conditions, reflecting the evolving nature of royal authority and the diminishing tolerance for perceived threats. Surviving documents indicate that her detention involved increased surveillance and limited interaction with attendants, suggesting a shift toward more controlled forms of imprisonment. In contrast, some noblewomen experienced prolonged confinement without immediate execution. Lady Jane Grey, whose brief reign in 1553 placed her at the center of a succession crisis, was held in the Tower following her deposition. Historical records indicate that her imprisonment was initially intended as a temporary measure, reflecting uncertainties within the new regime. However, subsequent uprisings altered the political calculus, leading to her execution. Chroniclers noted that her case exemplified how quickly the status of a prisoner could change in response to external events. The Tower's function as a site of imprisonment for noblewomen continued into the later Tudor and early Stuart periods, though the frequency and nature of such detentions evolved alongside broader changes in governance. Surviving documents suggest that the increasing centralization of authority and the development of more formal legal institutions gradually altered the role of the Tower. Nevertheless, it remained a potent symbol of royal power and a practical instrument for managing individuals whose positions made them both valuable and dangerous. Throughout these cases, a consistent pattern emerges. The imprisonment of noblewomen in the Tower was not merely a matter of confinement, but a calculated response to the complexities of power. Their status required that they be treated in ways that acknowledged their rank, yet their perceived threats necessitated close control. Historical records indicate that this balance was maintained through a combination of physical restriction, administrative oversight, and symbolic gestures that reinforced the authority of the crown. The lived reality of these women, as reconstructed from surviving documents, reveals a system in which privilege and vulnerability coexisted. Their chambers might be furnished, their meals adequate, and their attendants familiar, yet their autonomy was sharply curtailed. Letters were filtered, visits regulated, and futures uncertain. Chroniclers noted that even in cases where execution did not follow, the experience of imprisonment could have lasting consequences, affecting reputations, alliances, and the distribution of estates. In examining these histories, the Tower emerges not simply as a place of incarceration, but as an institution embedded within the political and social structures of its time. The confinement of noblewomen reflects broader patterns of governance, in which control was exercised through a combination of legal authority, social hierarchy, and strategic restraint. The administrative logic that governed the imprisonment of noblewomen within the Tower of London did not operate in isolation. Surviving documents suggest that decisions regarding confinement were closely tied to the deliberations of the monarch and the Privy Council, where assessments of risk, loyalty, and political utility shaped outcomes. In many cases, the continued detention of a noblewoman reflected not only past actions, but the potential consequences of her release. Her lineage, marital connections, and symbolic value could extend far beyond the Tower's walls. Contemporary correspondence indicates that imprisonment often functioned as a holding condition, while authorities evaluated shifting political circumstances. Noblewomen were rarely processed through a standardized judicial system in the modern sense. Instead, their cases unfolded through a combination of interrogations, council reviews, and at times parliamentary acts. Legal codes of the period reveal that charges such as treason were broadly defined, allowing for considerable discretion in their application. This flexibility enabled the Crown to respond to perceived threats without the constraints of rigid procedure. The experience of Margaret Pole illustrates the extent to which noble status could both delay and intensify the consequences of accusation. As a member of the Plantagenet lineage, her existence carried dynastic implications that extended into the reign of Henry VIII. Historical records indicate that her arrest in 1538 was linked to suspicions surrounding her son, Reginald Pole, who had opposed the king's religious policies. Surviving documents suggest that her imprisonment in the Tower lasted for several years, during which time her case remained unresolved in formal legal terms. Chroniclers noted that her eventual execution in 1541 occurred without a conventional trial, reflecting a process in which political necessity outweighed procedural norms. Her prolonged confinement underscores how imprisonment could function as an intermediate state, neither fully punitive nor provisional, but sustained by uncertainty. Financial accounts from the Tower provide further insight into the material conditions of noble imprisonment. These records detail expenditures for food, fuel, bedding, and in some cases medical care. The allocation of such resources was not uniform. Rather, it reflected ongoing assessments of a prisoner's status and the Crown's willingness to maintain appearances of propriety. Surviving documents suggest that even in confinement, distinctions of rank were preserved through diet, accommodation, and the number of permitted attendants. This preservation of hierarchy served both practical and symbolic purposes, reinforcing the social order even as individuals were removed from active participation within it. At the same time, chroniclers noted that these material provisions did not eliminate the constraints imposed by surveillance. The lieutenant of the Tower and subordinate warders were responsible for ensuring that prisoners adhered to strict conditions. Movement within the Tower complex was regulated, and access to external information was carefully controlled. Letters, when permitted, were often inspected or dictated under supervision. Contemporary accounts describe how some prisoners attempted to communicate covertly, relying on intermediaries or coded language, though such efforts carried significant risk. The case of Elizabeth I, during her imprisonment in 1554 under the reign of her half-sister Mary I, demonstrates how the Tower could be used to contain individuals whose political significance was not yet fully resolved. Historical records indicate that Elizabeth was confined on suspicion of involvement in Wyatt's Rebellion, a movement opposing Mary's proposed marriage to Philip of Spain. Surviving documents suggest that evidence directly implicating Elizabeth was limited, yet her position as a potential alternative claimant to the throne made her presence outside confinement untenable. During her imprisonment, she was subjected to interrogation and close observation, though her treatment remained consistent with her status as a royal princess. Chroniclers noted that her eventual release reflected a calculation that continued detention might provoke further instability rather than prevent it. This pattern, where imprisonment functioned as a mechanism for managing uncertainty, appears repeatedly in the historical record. Noblewomen whose cases could not be conclusively resolved were often held until political conditions shifted. In some instances, this resulted in release and restoration. In others, it led to renewed accusations or harsher outcomes. The Tower thus operated as a space where time itself became an instrument of governance, allowing authorities to delay decisions while maintaining control. Religious conflict further complicated the imprisonment of noblewomen during the 16th century. The oscillation between Catholic and Protestant regimes created conditions in which expressions of faith could be interpreted as acts of political defiance. Legal codes of the period reveal that adherence to unauthorized religious practices could be prosecuted under statutes designed to enforce conformity. Noblewomen, whose households often served as centers of local influence, were particularly susceptible to scrutiny. Surviving documents suggest that their imprisonment was sometimes intended to disrupt networks of religious affiliation as much as to punish individual actions. The experience of Lady Arbella Stewart in the early 17th century illustrates the continued relevance of dynastic considerations. As a cousin to King James I and a potential claimant to the throne, Arbella's personal decisions were closely monitored. Historical records indicate that her unauthorized marriage in 1610 was interpreted as a political threat, prompting her confinement within the Tower. Contemporary accounts describe how her imprisonment was accompanied by increasing restrictions, particularly after attempts to escape were uncovered. Surviving documents suggest that her health deteriorated during her confinement, culminating in her death in 1615. Chroniclers noted that her case reflected the persistent tension between individual agency and the perceived needs of the state. Across these cases, the role of gender emerges as a significant, though often implicit, factor in the administration of imprisonment. Noblewomen were rarely accused of direct military or administrative rebellion. Instead, charges often centered on influence, association, or perceived manipulation of political actors. Legal language of the period frequently framed their actions in terms of persuasion or conspiracy, reflecting broader assumptions about women's roles within power structures. At the same time, their capacity to bear heirs and transmit claims made them integral to dynastic politics, increasing the stakes of their confinement. Surviving letters written by imprisoned noblewomen provide limited but valuable insight into their lived experiences. These documents, often composed under supervision, tend to emphasize loyalty, humility, and appeals for mercy. Contemporary accounts suggest that such language was not merely rhetorical but strategic, aligning with expectations of appropriate conduct. Requests for improved conditions, clarification of charges, or intervention by influential figures were framed within these conventions, reflecting an understanding of the mechanisms through which relief might be obtained. The psychological dimensions of imprisonment, while less directly documented, can be inferred from patterns within these sources. Extended periods of confinement, uncertainty regarding outcomes, and restricted communication contributed to conditions that chroniclers described in terms of distress or decline. In cases where imprisonment ended in execution, the interval between accusation and sentence could span weeks or months, during which prisoners remained under constant observation. This temporal aspect of confinement reinforced the authority of the Crown, demonstrating its capacity to determine not only outcomes, but the pace at which they unfolded. By the early 17th century, changes in legal and administrative practices began to alter the function of the Tower as a site of noble imprisonment. The development of alternative forms of detention, including house arrest and confinement in other facilities, reflected a broader evolution in governance. Nevertheless, the Tower retained its symbolic significance, particularly in cases involving individuals of high status or political sensitivity. Surviving documents suggest that its use in such contexts was as much about visibility as practicality, reinforcing the association between the fortress and the enforcement of royal authority. Taken together, these records indicate that the imprisonment of noblewomen in the Tower was a multifaceted process shaped by legal flexibility, political calculation, and social hierarchy. Their confinement cannot be understood solely as punishment. It functioned as a mechanism through which the Crown managed uncertainty, neutralized potential threats, and maintained the appearance of order. Within this system, noblewomen occupied a position that was at once constrained and consequential, their fates determined by forces that extended far beyond the confines of their chambers. By the later 17th century, the use of the Tower of London as a primary site for the long-term imprisonment of noblewomen had begun to decline, reflecting broader transformations in English governance. Surviving documents suggest that the consolidation of legal institutions, alongside the increasing role of Parliament, introduced new mechanisms for handling political dissent and dynastic uncertainty. While the Tower remained operational as a prison, its function shifted toward more symbolic and selective use, particularly in cases where public visibility carried political weight. Historical records indicate that earlier patterns of confinement, where noblewomen were held for extended periods without formal trial, became less common as procedural norms evolved. The expansion of legal recourse, though uneven and often limited by status and circumstance, began to impose constraints on the discretionary authority previously exercised by the Crown. Legal codes of the period reveal a growing emphasis on evidentiary standards and formal charges, even in cases involving high-ranking individuals. This did not eliminate the potential for politically motivated imprisonment, but it altered the framework within which such decisions were justified. At the same time, the symbolic resonance of the Tower persisted. Chroniclers noted that its association with royal authority and historical precedent continued to shape its use. When noblewomen were confined there in the later period, their imprisonment often carried a deliberate message, reinforcing continuity with earlier practices while adapting to contemporary conditions. The Tower's architecture and visibility within London made it a site where the exercise of power could be both enacted and observed. The legacy of earlier imprisonments remained evident in the ways subsequent cases were interpreted. Surviving documents suggest that the experiences of figures such as Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane Grey continued to inform perceptions of the Tower as a place where political crises reached their resolution. These precedents contributed to an enduring understanding of the fortress not merely as a physical space, but as an instrument of statecraft embedded within the historical memory of the realm. The transition toward alternative forms of confinement is particularly evident in the increasing use of house arrest for noblewomen deemed politically sensitive. Historical records indicate that this approach allowed authorities to maintain control while reducing the visibility associated with imprisonment in the Tower. Noble households, when placed under supervision, could function as controlled environments in which movement and communication were restricted without the need for relocation to a central fortress. Surviving documents suggest that this method was often preferred in cases where overt imprisonment might provoke public sympathy or political backlash. Nevertheless, the underlying logic of containment remained consistent. Noblewomen continued to be assessed in terms of their connections, influence, and potential to disrupt established authority. Contemporary accounts describe how marriages, correspondences, and even informal associations were scrutinized for indications of disloyalty or ambition. The mechanisms of control evolved, but the concerns that motivated them, dynastic stability, religious conformity, and the preservation of order, persisted across generations. The long-term consequences of imprisonment for noblewomen extended beyond their immediate confinement. Surviving documents indicate that even after release, many faced restrictions on movement, limitations on their ability to participate in court life, and diminished access to networks of patronage. Estates could be forfeited or placed under supervision, and reputations, once compromised, were difficult to restore. Chroniclers noted that these outcomes were not incidental, but integral to the broader system of governance, reinforcing the consequences of perceived disloyalty. In examining these patterns, it becomes evident that the Tower functioned within a continuum of disciplinary practices rather than as an isolated phenomenon. The imprisonment of noblewomen represented one expression of a wider set of strategies through which authority was maintained. Legal proceedings, financial penalties, and social marginalization all formed part of this framework, interacting with physical confinement to produce outcomes that extended beyond the individual cases. The available evidence also highlights the limits of documentation. While administrative records, correspondence, and chroniclers' accounts provide valuable insight, they do not capture the full extent of individual experience. Many aspects of daily life within the Tower, routine interactions, informal negotiations, and personal reflections, remain only partially visible. Surviving documents suggest that prisoners adapted to their circumstances in ways that were not always recorded, developing strategies to navigate the constraints imposed upon them. Despite these limitations, certain patterns can be discerned. The preservation of rank within confinement, the regulation of communication, and the use of time as a controlling factor appear consistently across cases. These elements contributed to a system in which imprisonment was not solely about physical restriction, but about the management of identity and influence. Noblewomen, whose status was both a source of privilege and a potential liability, were subject to forms of control that reflected this duality. The Tower's enduring presence in historical narratives reflects its role as a focal point for these dynamics. Contemporary accounts and later interpretations have emphasized its association with dramatic events, yet the surviving records suggest a more complex reality. Much of the Tower's function was administrative and procedural, embedded within the routines of governance. The imprisonment of noblewomen, while often linked to moments of crisis, was also part of a broader pattern of calculated decision-making. Over time, the visibility of such imprisonments contributed to their symbolic power. Chroniclers and later historians have noted how the Tower came to represent the intersection of authority and vulnerability, where individuals of high status could be rendered subject to the same mechanisms of control as lesser figures, albeit in modified form. This duality reinforced the legitimacy of the system while also exposing its capacity for severity. The evolution of these practices did not erase their historical impact. Surviving documents indicate that the precedents established in earlier centuries continued to influence perceptions of governance and justice. The treatment of noblewomen within the Tower became part of a larger narrative about the reach of royal authority and the conditions under which it was exercised. These narratives, in turn, shaped expectations and responses in subsequent periods. In the broader context of English history, the imprisonment of noblewomen in the Tower can be understood as a reflection of the tensions inherent in a hierarchical society undergoing transformation. The balance between tradition and adaptation, between personal status and institutional authority, is evident in the ways these cases were managed. Historical records suggest that the Tower served as a site where these tensions were negotiated, often with outcomes that carried lasting consequences. The documented fate of these women, viewed collectively, reveals a system that relied on both continuity and change. While the specific circumstances of each case varied, the underlying principles, control, surveillance, and the preservation of order, remained consistent. The Tower, as both a physical structure and a symbol, embodied these principles, providing a setting in which the complexities of power could be enacted with clarity and consequence. In the end, the surviving evidence does not present a single, unified narrative, but rather a series of interconnected cases that illuminate the workings of authority across time. The imprisonment of noblewomen in the Tower of London reflects not only individual fates, but the broader mechanisms through which a society defined and defended its structures of power.